Hello and welcome to this first episode of the Speedrun series focusing on playing the French defense uh, in the rapid rating pool on chess.com. For this video series, I'm going to be playing, as I just said, the French defense. And the reason I'm playing this particular opening is because this is an opening that I made a Chessable course on the website chessable.com. The name of the course was the French Defense Simplified. So I'm going to be playing this repertoire in this speedrun series. We're starting off with the rating level of 600, and we're going all the way up to the rating level of 2000 plus. Of course, not all of those games in that particular rating level are going to be in this one episode. In this particular episode, we are starting off with the 600 rating all the way up to 700 rating, and that's what we're going to be covering in this particular episode with these couple of games. You'll see how I was thinking through the different positions, how I'm able to play the repertoire. Even if the opponent kind of steps outside of the repertoire, we can still play good moves that are going to be able to take advantage of some of the mistakes that they're making. But then I explain my thinking process throughout each of the games, talk about the mistakes that they make, how we can punish them, and how we are able to get these wins. So hopefully you enjoy the video, enjoy the games, and I will see you around in the next one. All right, so we have our first French defense game here. Our opponent is playing e4. I'm going for e6, sticking with our French defense repertoire. They go for d3, which is a move that you will see at the lower rating level quite a lot. Sometimes white's going for a kind of King's Indian attack as setup. I'm going to go ahead, though, and just stick with the normal pawn to d5 here. White goes for the move knight f3. Now, in this version of things, because white did not play the move knight to d2, it is entirely possible for us to trade the pawns on e4 and then trade the queens. And once once white recaptures with their king, they're no longer able to castle, and it's already a little bit of an advantage for black because white's king will be stuck in the center. So I'm just going to continue with that idea. We're going to trade the queens now. White, of course, has to take back with their king. And then we are going to put some pressure on their pawns in this position. So there's two ways of doing that here. We can go knight f6 to attack the e4 pawn, or we can go bishop c5 to attack the f2 pawn. Both moves, I think, are good. I'm leaning towards the bishop c5 move first. It is a little bit more awkward for white to protect the f2 pawn as opposed to protecting the e4 pawn. So we're going to start with bishop c5, hit the f2 pawn. White has to play king e1 or e2 to defend it. They could play bishop e3, which is what my opponent's going for here, but it's not a very good option. The main issue here is that once I do trade the bishops and white recaptures, they're going to be stuck with these two weak pawns in this position. These are what would be known as double isolated e-pawns. They're isolated in the sense that there is no friendly F or D pawn for the opponent on one of the adjacent files. And they're doubled in the sense that they are on top of each other. Like if you think of like a, I don't know, like a double quarter pounder or something, some kind of burger or something like that. The two burger or patties are stacked on top of each other here. But okay, the main issue with this is that these pawns are going to need pieces to protect them. They aren't going to be able to be protected by any of white's friendly pawns. That's kind of the main problem they run into. So that being said, I think I'm just going to go ahead and start off with the move knight f6. Let's attack the forward of the two pawns. They'll either defend it with one of their pieces. Okay, they go for bishop d3 to defend it, which is logical. If they had advanced the pawn, I would have probably played knight to g4 to attack a bunch of different weaknesses, knight to c6 to hit the pawn again. White would have a lot of trouble keeping those pawns defended. Okay, given the circumstance here, I do still want to apply more pressure to this pawn. I could go knight d7 to c5. That's one way of doing it. b6 and bishop b7 is another way of attacking the pawn as well. I'm leaning a little bit towards the b6 bishop to b7 route, I will say. So I think I'm going to go for that one here. Let's put the bishop here, attack the pawn. Okay, white gives a check. Don't really know if the check is all that useful. I can either block with the pawn and probably kick them right back to d3, or I can block with the bishop. And if they trade the bishops, then they're kind of just helping me develop more pieces, and they're still going to be kind of stuck with this problem of the weak pawns in this position. So I'm not entirely sure which one I should do. I think I'm leaning a little bit more towards the bishop move. If I go pawn to c6 and they go back to d3, it kind of feels like the bishop is a little bit less useful. So I think I'm going to go for this bishop block. I am still threatening to take the pawn on e4 at the same time. And of course, now I'm also attacking the bishop too. So white plays c4 to guard the bishop, but they don't really do much or anything here to protect their e4 pawn. So the question is, do I want to take the pawn right away? Do I want to trade the bishops first? Do I want to maybe even play a move like c6 to hit the bishop first? I think I'm just going to take the pawn first. If I take the bishop, it becomes a little bit awkward to develop my knight, I will say. So I think I'm just going to take the pawn to begin with. And I'm also threatening knight f2 check, which is a very big threat that they have to watch out for. Sorry about any background noise. There's probably a truck going by. But yeah, we're threatening knight f2 check, which is a huge threat. And we're up a pawn. White has this continued leftover isolated pawn. Okay, they're going for the move knight e5. This doesn't really address my threat of knight f2 check. I think before I give the check, I'm going to trade the bishops first. It is also possible just to make the check and take the rook and not rush for the trade, but I think I'm just going to trade pieces first to begin with. They will take back with their pawn, but now I can give the check, I can take the rook in the corner, and we're going to be ahead quite a bit of material. It is possible for white to trap my knight in the corner, so once I do take the rook here, the knight is not escaping. They could just develop their knight somewhere, and yeah, my knight is kind of stuck in the corner of the board, so we are going to lose that knight. But remember, we took a rook in the process, so even if we lose the knight, we gained a rook, lost a knight, we still won material there. The rook is worth 5 points, the knight's worth 3, and so we can work towards utilizing our advantage there. Okay, so I'm not going to rush doing anything with the knight. It is possible to like give a check and have them take and double their pawns, but I kind of like the idea of making them, you could say, kind of burn a move to capture the knight. So I'd rather white have to burn a move to take the knight, and me get to do a couple of things in the in the meantime. So I think my first thought is playing knight to d7 just to facilitate more piece trades. When you're ahead material, trading pieces is usually a good idea. I think that's the simplest thing here. I'll just go knight d7. If they trade, that's great. If they don't trade, that's also fine. If they don't trade, they're going to have to, kind of burn time moving their knight around. So they do avoid the trade. They play knight to c6. I think here now I'm going to play the move a6. This is at least an idea I'm thinking about. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm leaning towards a6, I suppose. I could also castle first, but maybe a6. I want to trade pawns and open up the line for the rook here. For example, if they take my knight, I take their pawn, and then my rook gets opened up, and maybe it can be useful in a situation like that. If they take my pawn, okay, they're taking with the rook here. I'm going to take this, I'm going to take this pawn. Yeah, I think I should. If they take with the knight, I'll take the pawn on a2. Okay, so I think we're going to take the pawn on a2 here. We have to be a little bit careful, I will say. If he takes on c7, king has to move, rook here. Actually gets a little bit dicey, I will say. There are some issues with my kind of lack of development, you could say. So maybe in a case like this, rather than grabbing the pawn and having a lot of development issues, I think it might just be better to castle here first. I think that's what I'll go for now that I'm thinking more about it. I think I'll just go ahead and castle. I don't mind if they take the c-pawn. I'll take the a-pawn in that case in return. It's a slightly awkward position. These knights are actually quite annoying for me. But okay, they do take the pawn. I'm going to take on a2. It looks like rook to c8 would be a good idea to line up towards the two knights, but if you do rook to c8, there's knight to e7 check, forking the king and the rook, which is not a great situation. So I'm going to go ahead and take the pawn. Probably move my knight away, maybe knight b8, offer a trade, knight c5. But I am also attacking the pawn on b2. I would still like to play rook c8, but knight e7 is still the main issue. So with that in mind, Let's see here. I think I'm going to just play knight c5. I really do need to get this rook in the game. It's actually quite annoying because actually every single one of these squares is off limits in this position. All of them are either protected by the knight or the c8 square is, running into that fork. So, slightly annoying for sure. I think because of that, I'm going to do something that maybe looks a little bit weird. I'm going to go knight to b8 here, I believe. Not only do I want to trade a pair of pieces, but I also really just want to get these knights off of the c6 and c7 squares. They do avoid the trade, but now I at least have the access to the d8 square available, and maybe knight to a6 can also be useful to offer another trade of pieces. So, okay, I'm going to get my rook activated ASAP at this point. I am on the open file, and now rook to d7 is actually a very big threat to attack both the knights. White's rook is tied down to protecting the b2 pawn. This e7 knight can't move. This knight could go back to b5, but that's about it. Okay, so they're just pushing pawns. I'm going to go rook to d7. I am now forking the two knights. And there's really not a whole lot white can do to defend against this. Rook to d1 is an interesting idea, hoping I take one of the knights and get mated on the back rank, but rook d1 also allows me to take the b2 pawn and trade more pieces, which is totally fine with me. So there's really not a good way to protect against both of these threats without some kind of concession or something that I'm happy about allowing in the first place. And yeah, we're going to just pick up more material and eventually look to win with that extra material. Okay, they take on e6. I can take either one of the knights. I could take on e7. I could take on e6. I think I'm just going to take on e6, though, because it looks like the knight on e7 is still pretty well stuck. The only safe square is c8. And if it goes to c8, it's still kind of trapped on my side of the board, so that's still going to be a bit of an issue for them. Okay, goes back to f5. That's a free knight there. The only thing I have to be careful about in this position now is any kind of back rank checkmate. I can't tell you how many students' games I've seen over the years where they're up a ton of material, completely winning position, and they don't think like it's a very important question to ask yourself is, how could I lose this game? I'm up a rook, I'm up a knight. How could I lose this game? I could lose this game if a back rank checkmate happened. So I know that there's tons of moves that are also available that are good here. I'm just going to play the move h5 or h6, probably just h6. Now there's no more back rank mates that are ever going to be possible, and I'm just going to work towards winning with my extra material. So I'm going to go, let's say, knight to c6, develop the knight. White is still tied down to the b2 pawn. They go king here. I'm going to go ahead and probably, again, lots of moves are good. I'm going to give a check with the knight in the center. I'm assuming the king moves up. Now I have a couple of moves that are good here. I could check on d3. I can also take the pawn on b2, because if white takes with the rook, then I have the fork, and then I take the rook. So I think I'm going to go for that option. Let's take this pawn. I could have also checked with the knight first and then took the pawn, but we'll do it this way. King moves, we take the rook, and then we're just up a ton of material in the resulting endgame here. Okay, king moves, take the rook. He's going to try to push the pawn. I'm just going to go ahead and bring the knight back. Let's say back here. He's going to push the pawn for sure. I'm just going to block the pawn. I don't think I really need to do anything all that fancy. And then I'm just going to push my b pawn up the board. I think this is the simplest route to winning the game. These pawns are all blockaded pretty much. And I'll just push my pawn up the board. We could also start looking for like checkmate ideas, I will say. Knight e5 kind of traps the king. It is not stalemate because white could play the move f6. But we will be able to deliver checkmate pretty quickly there. I think this is, okay, this is the quickest for sure. Let's go knight e5. f6 is pretty much forced. And we will have a checkmate around the corner here. So f6. I can take the pawn. They have to take on h6. That's the only legal move. And then rook h7 would be checkmate. Of course, you could have also won the game by just pushing the b pawn up the board. But yeah, we're going to go for this route. Take here, maybe mainly just double checking that it's not stalemate. He takes here, and then rook h7 is the checkmate in this position. Okay, so we got a very nice looking checkmate there at the end. In terms of the opening, our opponent made kind of this, I would call like inaccurate move with knight f3. If they want to play this d3 setup, usually you should play knight to d2 first, and then after something like, let's say, knight f6, then knight f3. This is a position that I have mentioned in the simplified French course on Chessable. If white plays knight f3 right away, though, it does allow us this idea to trade the pawns, trade the queens, hit the f2 pawn, and black is doing perfectly fine in a position like this. We saw that white made this mistake of playing bishop e3, and then they end up with these weak pawns that we were able to attack and take advantage of as the game went on. So the biggest thing I'd say from this game is, like, once you create the weakness, trying to attack it, figure out how you're going to organize your pieces to go after those weak pawns. For instance, I wanted to play bishop b7, and then one day put the knight on c5, and have a lot of things attacking this this pawn on e4. That was kind of my game plan here. So whatever your advantage is in a position, if you have an advantage, in this case we have the advantage of our opponent having a weak pawn, or a pair of weak pawns, you want your game plan to revolve around your advantages. You don't want to just, oh, I want to attack. I want to attack because attacking's fun. Especially if you have no advantage revolving around the opponent's king. Like right now, there's no queens on the board. It's kind of not easy to attack white's king right away, but it's easier to attack the weak pawns. And that's kind of what we're prioritizing in this example. Okay, so that was this game. Let's go ahead and get into the next one here. All right, so we've got our next game here, playing against Alec Edkisgood, however they're wanting to say that username. They are rated 653 from Canada. They start off with the move e4. We're going for our French defense here with e6. Let's see what second move they decide to go for. d4, definitely the most common and objectively best move. Though in this kind of 600 rating level, you will see lots of different other options. The previous game, we saw the opponent playing d3. This particular opponent's going for queen f3. So generally speaking, not great to bring your queen out this early in the game, especially when there's not really much of a point or threat behind this move. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue with the move d5. Don't really see any reason not to just go ahead and stick with the typical idea, d5 here. If the opponent trades in the center, then we'll have the central pawn there. They decide to play the move knight c3. So here we have a couple of different options. I don't know if I specifically had the move queen f3 in my French simplified chessable course. Against this setup of knight c3 and queen f3, the options we have here are we could go ahead and play the move pawn takes e4, so attacking the queen, and this could kind of maybe set up into a type of Fort Knox idea, which is mentioned in the course. Pawn to d4 is another idea that's probably the better option here. We advance forward, we attack the knight. I think I'm going to go for this option. I think I'll just go ahead and advance the pawn, attack the knight. Knight will probably go back to e2 is my guess. And then I'll probably just work on developing, developing the rest of my pieces here, just trying to get them activated and into the game here. So knight e2 is the move I'm assuming is going to be played. Okay, but knight b5 is the response instead. The downside of the knight on this specific square is it doesn't really have anywhere further it can move forward to. For example, if we just go ahead and make the move a6 in this position, we're attacking the knight. The knight would have to go back to the a3 square. Our pawn on d4 is defended, so that's not an issue. And the pawn on c7 is also defended, so once again, that's also not an issue to worry about here. So pawn to a6 is the move I'm considering. I also don't necessarily need to be in a rush to do this. I could just go ahead and play e5 in the center, or knight c6 first, but I really don't see a reason not to go ahead and just play a6. Let's kick the knight back to the edge of the board, get it back to this kind of passive location on a3. And then after that, probably I'll just develop the knight to c6 and go from there. So let's see what white does. Okay, this opponent goes back to the c3 square. This is just allowing us to take the knight for free. Nothing really too fancy here. They definitely should have gone to the a3 square. But okay, they move the knight back to an unsafe location. We get to take the piece for free. They don't recapture. Based on the way this opponent's playing, I'm kind of assuming that they're, they probably play this way against a lot of people at their rating level here. They probably just set up this queen f3, bishop c4 type of stuff. First of all, they're not even threatening checkmate at this point. We do have the pawn on e6 blocking off the bishop, so that's not really even an issue for us to worry about. The question here is, do I want to take the pawn on d2 or do I want to take the pawn on b2? I also could decide to take neither one of them and kind of make white burn a move taking the pawn themselves. I'm not super keen on taking d2 and helping them get closer to castling queenside. A rook on d1 could be a little bit annoying for my queen on d8 to deal with. Taking on b2 also kind of helps them to accelerate their development. So I'm already up an entire piece here. I actually don't really want to take either one of these pawns, quite honestly. What I'm going to do here is actually, I'm leaning towards the move queen f6. And the idea with queen f6 is not only do I simply want to trade queens, because I am ahead a piece. Usually when you're ahead material, trading pieces, and especially the queens, is usually a good idea. But it's almost kind of mandatory once I play this move for white to allow the queen trade, because if they try to avoid the trade, my queen on f6 will also be helping to attack the pawn on b2. So I think I'm going to go for this move. If they take with the queen, we take with the knight. If they take with the queen, we could also insert the move pawn takes d2 with check first before recapturing. But we'll cross that bridge if they decide to take. If they don't take, though, I am also threatening to capture the pawn on b2. The queen on f6 is helping to attack it. Okay, they don't take my queen. They play knight h3. So I could trade the queens. But it might even be better here to take the pawn on b2. Because, again, my queen is also helping to attack that pawn. So we can take here on b2. If they recapture, then we'll take with the queen, and we'll be up 2 pieces in that situation rather than just being up 1 piece. So they take with the bishop. Okay, instead of trading the queens, we're going to take the bishop on b2. We are attacking the rook that's on a1. And probably, after they castle is my assumption. Okay, they play the move knight f4. This doesn't really address the threat that I have on the rook here. So I'm just going to go ahead and take the rook with check. The king will move. I will go ahead and take the other rook. I don't see any threats or anything white can really do in the meantime. Not really sure what the idea with knight d5 is. They're threatening to take the pawn, of course. I'm just going to take the knight. They're going to take with the bishop. They're really hoping that their kind of one threat in the position works out for them. I'm just going to go ahead and play the move knight f6 to block off the queen. And we're also threatening bishop to g4 at the same time. And this is what white is missing here. I could, of course, take the bishop on d5, but playing bishop g4 to pin the queen is even better. And we are going to win the queen in this position. And once we win the queen, white simply has no pieces left at this point. So, kind of get the feeling in this game that white was just very, very focused on trying to get this like queen f3, bishop c4, like attack that they're going for. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take the queen with check. And now I can also take the bishop here. We're just ahead every piece on the board, and they do end up residing. Okay, so we'll do an analysis here. So again, e4, e6, queen f3. So pretty much with really almost any move that white can play on the second move of the game, there's really only one move I can think of that would discourage us from playing the move d5. And I think in the course, I do mention that a move like queen to e2 does discourage us from playing d5. If they play the move queen to e2 and then we play d5, they would be able to capture the pawn, and then we would not be able to recapture with the pawn because of the pin on the e-file. So queen to e2 is pretty much the only move that will discourage us from what we're trying to do here. Queen f3, though, doesn't really change a whole lot. We just continue with d5. And then d4 to hit the knight. Of course, white should have played the move knight back to a3, after which I think I was going to go ahead and play knight to c6. And black is definitely a little bit better off here. The knight on a3 is misplaced. The queen is a potential target to attack. I have more space in the center. I can play knight f6, maybe pawn the e5, bring the bishop out. And yeah, black is in very pleasant shape here. And white also doesn't really have a good way to get the knight back in the game. Even if they play a move like knight to c4, I think I can just go ahead and play pawn to b5, attacking the knight, and the knight would have to go right back to the a3 square. So once they lost the knight on c3, yeah, it's a very bad position for white already, of course. I did like this queen f6 move. Maybe there's other moves that are objectively better, but the idea of pretty much forcing white to trade queens, they really should have probably gone ahead and taken the queen or played something like queen takes c3. If they had done this, I would have just traded the queens and then just played the game with an extra piece at this point. So not really anything too fancy in this one. The opponent just kind of started giving away material. We just kind of captured the free stuff, especially those rooks. And then even though you might be ahead a ton of material or have a very large advantage in a game, it's very important to still be cognizant or aware of what the opponent's trying to do. It could be very easy in a position like this to say like, oh, I can take the pawn on h2. I'll just grab more material. And then you completely miss, white can take the pawn with check, and then the bishop with check, and then this pawn with check, and then the rook. And maybe black is still winning here because we were up so many pieces at the start, but very important when you have a very big advantage. You don't only want to focus on what you want to do, but you especially want to focus on what is the other guy or what is the opponent trying to do themselves. If you can shut down their counterplay or stop their threats, then converting your kind of large advantage in the first place becomes a lot easier. So very important here to stop the opponent's idea. And it also had this threat of making the pin. And in the game that worked out well. We won the queen, and that was it. All right, so that's it for this game. I'll see you in the next one. All right, so we've got another game where we're going to be playing our French defense. We're against, I think this is RN or M7009, rated 686 here. So e4, e6, knight f3. We go for d5, challenging the opponent's center. White can take the pawn, after which we would recapture and maybe transpose into an exchange French variation. In this case, they decide to advance the pawn. I'm going to go ahead here, and we go for the move c5 in this position. We just grab some extra space of our own, make it a little bit more difficult for white to play the move d4 themselves, and they go for it anyways. So this is actually a position that you can get out of a normal advanced French variation. So if white had played, let's say, e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, we go c5, and they go knight f3. So pretty much this is a transposition into that position. We'll probably talk a little bit more about that in the analysis afterwards. But it's very important in a position like this that we have the pawn on c5. The opponent does not have the pawn on d4 reinforced by a friendly pawn. Usually white will have the pawn on c3, or at least they should have the pawn on c3, in order to recapture the d4 pawn if we take it. In this case, because there's no pawn protecting d4, we're going to go ahead and take d4 right away, and we're going to force white to recapture with one of their pieces. And the problem for them with this is that without the d4 pawn being on the board, it ends up that the pawn on e5 is more of a target and more of a liability here. So next we go with the move knight to c6. We do challenge the knight, but also threaten to take the pawn on e5 at the same time. If white takes our knight, we take back. We have a pretty strong center. A very common move here is the bishop to b5 pin. The opponent might go for that. In this case, they go for this move, knight a3. I'm not really entirely sure what the game plan with this move was. Simply put, not only was knight c6 hitting the knight on d4, but it was also hitting that pawn on e5. And if I don't really see a reason not to take the pawn at this point, so we're just going to take it. I don't see any tricks that white could have up their sleeve. We take the pawn in the center. Now we have two central pawns compared to our opponent's 0 central pawns. So we're going to develop castle, and in the long run, we're just going to have a very nice position, mainly because of these, these advantages in the center. So white gives the check. Here I'm going to go for the move bishop to d7. I'm happy to trade off this pair of bishops. This is my opponent's good bishop compared to, well, it's really maybe not so much a good bishop anymore when they have no central pawns, but it is my bishop that was blocked in behind my light square pawns. So I'm pretty happy to get rid of that piece that wasn't very good. I will recapture with the queen. And generally speaking, when you're ahead material, trading pieces, almost always a good idea. You don't necessarily want to make every single trade that's possibly available, but you want to, like any kind of neutral trade is probably pretty good. So this was definitely an advantageous trade for us, not only because we're ahead material, but also because um, that wasn't really a bishop of ours that we were super happy about having. Okay, so white has played the move queen h5. They are attacking the knight that's on the e5 square. We don't want to let them take this, of course. Let's see here. I don't know if I really want to move the knight all that much, but if I go bishop d6, maybe the knight jumps forward. It's probably not that big of a deal, but let's see here. We could be a little tricky with our move order here. I actually like this move, bishop to b4, giving a check. Normally, this type of check is not really all that great because white will block with the pawn on c3, and in that case, we would actually have two pieces being attacked simultaneously, which is probably not a great situation for us. However, if we go for the check and white blocks, then we can actually play this move, knight to d3 check, attacking the king as well as the bishop once this pawn is moved forward. And I think that white's going to be in a pretty awkward situation because of this. The king is going to have to move, and that's not really a great case for white. So I am going to give this check. If you didn't want to go for the check, if you feel like it's a little too complicated, I think a move like knight to g6 or knight to c6 is also absolutely good here. I would like to take the knight on a3 before giving the check, but if I take the knight, white doesn't have to recapture the knight or the bishop on a3. They could take the knight on e5, and then my bishop would be attacked as well as my pawn on g7, and that's a little bit awkward for me. So I'm going to give this check first, and then once the king moves away somewhere, then I'll take the knight on a3. So I'm trying to solve kind of the idea of multiple pieces being attacked simultaneously, but I'm using a bunch of checks and forcing moves of my own in order to save both pieces and eventually come out of this with a bunch of trades being accomplished. So the king has to move, which is already not a great situation for white to be in. They move the king to the d2 square. Now, if I take the bishop on c1, white will potentially take my bishop on b4, and then my knight on c1 actually ends up being trapped in that position. So that's not really a great situation for me. I'm going to take the knight on a3 first. If white recaptures on a3, then I will consider taking the bishop. If he takes the knight, then I'll retreat my bishop, and the king on d3 is just going to be in a very, very risky looking location. So neither one of these captures are really something that white is all that happy about, and that's a pretty good sign for us, of course. So they do take on a3. I could retreat the knight and kind of keep my knight alive, but I think for the sake of simplicity here, if I move the knight backwards, white gets a free move. I guess it's still good for us, of course, but I'm just going to keep it simple here. I'm going to take the bishop. I guess the other option is to take the pawn on f2. Maybe at the end of the day, this is just better to go for. Take the pawn, then bring the knight back and give a check. Yeah, I think taking the pawn might just be even better here. So let's take the pawn, attack the rook in the corner. We can also play knight f6 kind of at almost any moment to attack the queen that's on the h5 square. And notice here, instead of just going for every single trade that's available, like for example, once they played this queen h5 move, I could have just grabbed the knight on a3, but we already saw that they could take my knight and make life a little bit difficult. I'm kind of constantly looking for like the strongest forcing move or most dangerous idea for the opponent in the first place. So that's what that's a good way of kind of converting advantages. You can definitely just play simple and just trade stuff, but trying to kind of get the most out of the position can be an even stronger way of playing. So instead of moving the knight, I'm going to make a different forcing move. I'm going to make the move knight f6 to attack the queen on h5. Depending on where the queen moves, probably I'll bring this knight back to e4 to give a check afterwards. And yeah, white's going to be down 2 pawns with a very bad pawn structure and a very unsafe king. So, okay, we bring the knight back and give a check. And then we can start to target the pawn on c3 pretty soon as well. Rook c8. Probably castle the king pretty soon. Very, very good position for black here. White is just struggling, very much in this position. So let's see where the king goes first of all. Probably king to c2 is white's best move, is my assumption. Here I can give a check with queen a4 if I want to. I can also play rook c8 first. I think I'll go for rook c8 first. I might as well just get more new pieces into the game, attack the pawn on c3 at the same time. I'm going to assume white plays bishop to b2. Okay, they don't even defend the c3 pawn, so now we have two attackers on the c3 pawn. White does also have two defenders, but the difference is when I take the pawn after that entire capture sequence, I will be gaining the pawn and the queen, which is 1 point plus 9, that's 10 points total, and I'll be losing the knight and the rook, which is 3 plus 5. I'm going to lose 8 points but gain 10, so that is a net positive for us. So we take on c3, fork the king and the queen. I'm going to assume the queen is going to take on c3. Okay, if the queen doesn't even take on c3, then I can take the queen without even losing the knight in the process. So we take the queen. Next we'll castle. Okay, if they take with the pawn, they are attacking our knight. I don't want to lose the knight for free. I'm going to drop the knight back. Let's say, I guess we'll just bring it back to the d6 square, keep everything safe and solid. Next we'll castle, and yeah, we're up a queen versus a rook with a very, very large advantage. King goes to c3. Okay, I'll just castle. Rook is going to come to the c8 square. Pawn will move to attack the knight. White's going to be facing a big attack in this position. So this does open up the e4 square, but I think I'll just involve the rook first. Let's play rook c8 check. Probably the king goes to d3. Okay, he starts running up the board. This is very risky. Do we have a checkmate sequence? There is a check on c4. There's a check with the pawn on a5. We cannot play queen b5. This is very close to being a checkmate, but the knight does protect the b5 square. So I think we'll just let's do rook to c4. We're also attacking the knight simultaneously. The king goes back to the b3 square. I guess I can just take the knight. I can also throw in this check with the queen first. Might as well do that. King goes back, take the knight. And yeah, white's down a ton of pieces. How do we finish things off here? The king is going to run back to b2 regardless of what I play. Let's do... I guess we'll just involve the knight. Could also use the rook. I don't know if it really matters all that much. We just need to keep attacking the king and picking up pieces. Here I can check with the queen. Once the king moves here, should be checkmate pretty soon. I think we can check with the knight. Lots of ways to do it. King goes here, rook c3 is going to be checkmate at that point. Okay, they can block with the bishop, but then we'll take the bishop once they block. King can't go to g4 and can't go to the second rank. All these squares are taken up. Okay, bishop blocks, we take, and we do deliver the checkmate here. Okay, so let's go back to analyze the opening. So e4, e6, knight f3, d5, they go for e5. Now in the course I do recommend this move c5, and if white goes for d4, we take the pawn, they take back, we go knight c6. The most common moves for white in this position are to play bishop to b5 and knight takes knight. Pretty much both of these moves address our threat of taking the pawn on e5 in the first place. Essentially here, if they don't do anything about this, we are just going to take the pawn as we saw in the game. So knight to a3 did nothing to deal with our threat on the e5 pawn. We took the pawn, and after they gave the check, block with the bishop. We're happy to trade pieces. And then from here, I think there's lots of moves that are good. I do like the way I handled things. I think bishop b4 check is pretty strong. Aside from this, if you wanted to keep it a bit simpler, I think something like knight to g6 or knight to c6 is very good. Again, we're happy to trade pieces, and especially because we're ahead that pawn. What we do maybe want to be a little bit careful about is taking the knight on a3, because here white doesn't have to recapture on a3. They can take the knight on e5. And this is what I was mentioning during the game. This is a little bit messy because both the bishop and the pawn are hit. you might very well have to bring the bishop back to f8 to keep everything safe, and I'm not crazy about the bishop having to go back to its starting square. So instead of that, I gave the check, another check. I did not want to rush to take the bishop because then white would take my bishop and my knight ends up being trapped, which is bad. So we take the other knight first. Then in this case, we take f2. Taking the bishop would have also been a, very good position, but we can grab an extra pawn, hit the queen, give a check, and then once white allows us to make the fork on their king and their queen, once we win the queen, it's pretty smooth sailing there. It's just about making more attacking moves, picking up more pieces, and getting the job done from there. Okay, so that's it for this third game. Hopefully you enjoyed the games that we've looked at in this video, focusing in the rating level of about 600 to 700, and hopefully you learned from the games that we looked at here.